Well, then let's start. Good morning. My name is Marilena Venditelli. I'm an associate professor of automatic control at the University of Rome La Sapienza. My research interests are in robotics, both in theoretical foundations and application, particular to the medical domain. Riccardo Acciai, the co-organizer of this workshop, is an officer of the Italian Authority for the Protection of Data, but today is here in his capacity of president of his association, Centro Studi Privacy and Nuove Tecnologie, within which we started to discuss now a few years ago about the complexity of the facilitating the development of new technologies while guaranteeing the respect of human rights. In fact, this is the context of this proposal of regulation of artificial intelligence, that is in the technology that best encompasses the pervasiveness of technology in our lives, both professional but as citizens, hence the necessity to regulate it. Now, in this workshop, we of course we are going to comment this proposal act that was published by the European Commission in last April, but we will not discuss the single articles, but rather the inspiring principles, the methodologies, and the definitions, in particular with respect to human rights. We will also make a point, necessarily partial point on the technology itself, on artificial intelligence, what we mean, which are the theoretical foundations, definitions, because the proposal of both sides tries to and provides a definition of artificial intelligence. So it is interesting to discuss how, to what extent this definition corresponds to the understanding and practice, also the knowledge of experts in the domain. We'll also try to understand one point from the methodological point of view, one point that is important, that is remarked in the proposal, it is the explicability of AI. And as said before, AI is one of the technologies that that is most pervasive with respect to the other. In particular, the conference that is in the TOS, this workshop studied, I mean, is about the embodiment of in robots of this intelligence. Andrea will talk about this. And then we will comment on the impact of this proposal of AI in general and the proposal to regulate it in different domains, from social to political to market, and also analyze, I think Emanuela Girardi is not yet here, but I mean, which is the role, which is the aim of European Union in publishing this act, if in fact it will have a leading role as it has been for GDPR, and what is happening. In fact, Emanuela will tell us what is happening now on the same domain outside, in the rest of the world, outside Europe. So I think that discussing nothing is yet, I mean, there is time for this regulation to be enforced. It will change. So I think it is not just our professional interest or intellectual curiosity that makes us discuss about this topic, but it's somehow also our duty as citizenship, because as said, human rights are the at the center, and humans are at the center of this technologies. Now they impact our lives in every direction. So now I let Riccardo make his own introduction, then we will leave space to the speakers that I think will tell us very interesting things. And okay, this is all. I will introduce each speaker before the respective talks. Okay, Riccardo, are you online? No. Riccardo? Dove vediamo? Riccardo is here, but he's not talking with the. Riccardo is, but it's, Riccardo, you...
No, io vi sentivo.
Okay. So this one word, about the language of the conference by default is English, but there is I mean, it's really open and free. You choose the language that you want. In fact, Riccardo, I think, who could not be here for private issues, and he will speak in Italian. So go ahead, Riccardo, sorry. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, may I share the... Do you, hello? Mi sentite?
Riccardo, ti sentiamo.
Vedete anche le slide per caso o no?
No.
Vabbè, volevo fare una prova prima, pazienza. Ok, thank you so much for...
Hai condiviso lo schermo? Perché dovresti essere abilitato a condividere.
Ci ho provato, ma evidentemente... Dunque,
non ci riesco. Vabbè, ok. Eccoti, adesso ti vediamo.
Mi vedete, già non è un pezzo avanti, ma non è quello che volevo. Scusate, vedo se riesco a condividere lo schermo, un secondo solo. Eccolo qua.
L'aveva scritto.
No, condividi. No, non è questo. Sorry.
Sì.
No, non è questo. Dunque, è questo qua. Ecco qua. Condividi. Ok. Ok. Vedete le slide?
Yeah. Sì.
Ok. Thank you very much. Sorry for this problem with these technical problems. So first of all, let me thank Marilena for having involved the Centro Studi Privacy e Nuove Tecnologie in this important initiative, and RIM for having accepted our workshop proposal, and all the speakers for having accepted our invitation. Marilena has already perfectly framed the scope and the purpose of the theme we want to analyze today. And I will obviously leave it to those who follow me to go into detail on the various profiles of analysis. I will focus only a few moments on some general aspects of the proposal presented by the Commission on the regulation of artificial intelligence, try to identify if, through the examination of some aspects with other recent similar legislative acts, and in particular with the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, it's possible to draw useful elements for the evaluation of the proposal itself. So the European Commission with the presentation of the proposal for regulation establishing harmonized and etc. for artificial intelligence intended to lay the foundation for establishing a legal framework aimed at regulating the European Union market for artificial intelligence. And in the same day, when 21st April, the Commission presented also a coordinated plan on artificial intelligence 2021 review and a proposal for a regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council on machinery products. It can be briefly said that the proposal of regulation classifies products that use artificial intelligence software on the basis of the risk of negative impact on fundamental rights, such as human dignity, freedom, equality, democracy, the right not to know discrimination, data protection, health and safety. The more the product is likely to endanger these rights, the stricter the measure taken to eliminate or reduce the negative impact, to the point of banning those products that are completely incompatible with these rights. Starting from these two contextual elements, regulatory action and methodological approach, some brief consideration can be made with the other EU legislative acts, and in particular with the aforementioned GDPR. Why the GDPR? Certainly, we know that data are the basis of artificial intelligence systems, and therefore a certain similarity between the two legislative texts can be considered quite normal. But perhaps there may be further elements that suggest a quick comparison. The GDPR certainly represents the most well-known recent example of a renewed favor towards a process of unification of the European Union legislation. As is well known, in fact, the regulations, unlike the directives, do not need to be transposed and are directly applicable within the individual member states. However, many of the latest regulations adopted, such as the GDPR or other in the process of being adopted, such as the so-called e-price regulation on electronic communication, which will replace the homonymous directive, or the proposal of regulation on machinery product mentioned above, followed the preliminary long experience of a directive and therefore a progressive approximation of the various national legislation. The Commission proposal doesn't have a similar precedent, and it seemed to many an early strike in an attempt to regulate as quickly as possible in a uniform manner a rapidly expanding sector. And so this perhaps is the first element to take into consideration, the absence of a consolidated specific expression from a regulatory point of view, of course. The difficulties reaching the proposal are evidenced by the time it took to draft it, and will probably be even more so by that's necessary to reach its definitive approval and its entry into force. In this, certainly the analogy with the GDPR, which took about 4 years to be published in the Journal of the European Union, and which had a further 2 years vacatio legis period, can probably give us some indication of the future of this proposal. Why so long a time frame? Evidently, as in the case of data processing and the electronic communication sector, there are a series of economic and strategic interests that radicalize the positions of the member states. Moreover, in the context of a lawmaking process, which notoriously has been for a long time in need of a major reform. The regulation of artificial intelligence doesn't seem to be an exception to this state of affairs. Further similarities can then be found in the methodological structure of the two legislative acts. Both, albeit with due singularities and differences, establish some restrictions for non-EU economic operators in the circulation of their goods and services in the EU, on the basis of rights recognized as fundamental by the EU, by various national constitutional charters, and by international treaties. And in order to set such restrictions, both acts state that the rules apply regardless of whether the economic operators in question are established in the EU or not. It is an attempt to influence non-EU regulation from the outside through the force of attraction of the market to make it compatible with the legal framework. A first relevant experiment in this sense is carried out by the GDPR, which in fact also applies to those subjects who, without establishing outside the Union, sell goods and services within it. The experience of these first years, we have to say, certainly cannot be said to be exciting, but some first results give us hope for the future. Another element in common seems to be able to be found in the construction of the regulatory scheme adopted, a set of main rules with the possibility of implementation by the member states and with regard to artificial intelligence, especially by the Commission, which will be able to update relevant parts of the regulation. This test, therefore, like the GDPR, is aware of the fact that the very rapid progress of technology does not allow for extremely detailed and, above all, excessively static standardization. And it must be acknowledged in these cases that the Euro-Unitarian legislator has put in place a rather agile mechanism for updating the test to the external reality. What then can perhaps be drawn from these analogies? First of all, that the process of approval and entry into force of the text, although in its genesis motivated by reasons of urgency, may not be very rapid due to a lack of previous experience of the very significant interests at stake both internally and externally to the European Union. Furthermore, it is not difficult to predict that it will be a text subject to frequent updates, albeit through the action of the Commission, aimed at following technological evolution, but also probably increasingly strategic market logics in the international context. The wide debate that the Commission proposal has created will only improve the results, and we are sure that even our small but highly qualified workshop will be able to add some interesting elements in increasingly unavoidable logic of the interdisciplinary nature of the knowledge and skill. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Riccardo. If we have questions for from the audience for Riccardo, otherwise we, since this was the introduction by the organizers, we move to the first presenter, first speaker, who is Federica Merenda. Federica, despite her very young age, has done already has a lot of experience. She's by the way, I was PhD candidate, or you got your PhD? Because I couldn't find this.
I will defend next week.
Okay,
but I already started my postdoc.
Yeah, exactly. So we can say she has a PhD in human rights and global politics, and she's a research fellow in political philosophy and robotics at the Institute of Biorobotics at Sant'Anna, Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. Pisa, but she's also a consultant expert in law and ethics of AI for the Italian government. And I mean, there is a long list of experiences of Federica on the subject, but I have already heard that in a presentation last spring, and she was really, I mean, clear, informative, and inspiring presentation. So Federica, go ahead.
Okay, so I hope I will be at least as informative as Professor Venditelli said. So, well, I will try to provide the essential framework regarding ethics and human rights with respect to the Artificial Intelligence Act, but I hope that we will have time for question and to debate that further during the at the end of this panel. As it was already said, as for the Artificial Intelligence Act, the form that the European Commission chose was that of the regulation, precisely in order to provide harmonized rules throughout Europe, but with the hope that this could become a standard much beyond Europe, as it happened with the GDPR. As it was already recalled by Professor Acciai and Professor Venditelli, this regulation does not stem from a vacuum. It is part of a much larger strategy that was announced by the President of the EU Commission, that is the European Digital Strategy, and the main objective of everything that is comprised within this strategy is to create a European Union digital single market, and possibly to influence the digital market even beyond the frontiers of Europe. The other strategic and normative acts that are part of this much larger strategy are the European Union White Paper on Artificial Intelligence that was adopted last year, and the European Data Strategy that sets out the strategy with regards to data that naturally is very much interconnected with artificial intelligence. Indeed, I would say that a peculiarity of the negotiations regarding the Artificial Intelligence Act is the fact that they are happening at the same time of other important negotiations, of other important regulations regarding data that are those that I list here: the Data Governance Act, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, and Data Act. The negotiations for all these future regulations are all still ongoing. So a complexity in this process is the fact that they are happening parallelly, so that the representatives of the member state participating to the negotiations, as well as the officers of the European Union institutions, must make them coherent while working parallelly on all these texts. The publication of the proposal on the part of the European Commission in April was preceded by other, let's say, acts that have been adopted by the other European Union institution. Indeed, we have the conclusions of the Council of the European Union of last October, precisely on this topic, on the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the context of artificial intelligence and digital change, that in a way gave a political guidance to what happened in the later negotiations. And the European Parliament as well participated to this process by adopting 4 resolutions last year in October, one of which is specifically related with the ethical aspects of artificial intelligence. Then the European Parliament actually adopted another resolution that focused on military aspects, but we will not delve into that because the Artificial Intelligence Act is just for civil applications, so not military application. So this resolution on the framework of ethical aspects, of course, is the one that interests us the most, as with regards to ethical principles and human rights. So I will try to focus on that, and I hope we will have time to talk about the definition of artificial intelligence that is in the Act, thanks to the following speakers and the subsequent debate. As for ethical principles, both the European Parliament resolution and the regulation proposal published by the Commission make reference to the assessment list for trustworthy artificial intelligence that has been produced and published already by the expert group, high-level expert group on artificial intelligence created by the European Commission itself, that was mandated to draft this that was called a dynamic checklist of ethical principles. So if you have a look at the Altai document, what you find is a list of constraints that people in charge of developing the technology should add to the technological constraint where designing the artificial intelligence tools and systems. The 7 principles that have been identified are the following: human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, non-discriminations also in the access to rights and fairness, environmental and societal well-being, and accountability. Still, well, here I tried to identify the challenges of making reference to these principles. Well, first of all, it must be said that they are much more present in the European Parliament resolution than in the proposal by the Commission. So in a way, we expected a stronger language on ethical principles in the regulation proposal that is not there yet as much. Of course, as they are ethical principles, their respect is not mandatory. And the framework they propose is a framework for self-assessment. It is a checklist, meaning that they are, these principles are operationalized in the form of questions that the developers have to ask in order to verify whether they are complying with these principles or not. But there is not, we have no provision of an external authority that verifies the compliance with these principles. And the whole debate about ethical principles and human rights with respect to technology in general is that very often in the debate, ethical guidelines are used in order to refer to ethical principle is a way to trump human rights and like actual normative and mandatory obligations. So it must be, we have to put attention to the fact that ethical principles are something, but we also need human rights and fundamental rights. We're not talking about the same thing, especially from a formal standpoint. As for fundamental rights, well, the first thing to note is that, as we all know, the Commission chose a risk-based approach, identifying 4 categories of risk and inserting the different artificial intelligence tools and systems within each of these categories. We have the unacceptable risk, that is the category of those AI systems and tools that are totally prohibited, totally banned. A high risk artificial intelligence that describe the main object of the regulation. Those that end up in this category need to be needs to pass a conformity assessment and the certification procedure. Limited risk artificial intelligence, for this we just have a transparency obligation, and those with minimal risk with no obligation. We can talk extensively about how the Commission defined this category, but let's say that the thing that I want to focus on with regards to the respect of fundamental rights is that there is a wide debate among the international lawyers about the per se compatibility of a risk-based approach with the protection of human rights and with the principles that are underlying in international human rights law. The point in these is the fact that if you choose a risk-based approach like this, the end goal is not necessarily to eliminate the risk to occur, but to get to a minimization of the risk. This means that there can be a residual risk of human rights, of threats to human rights that is caused by the introduction of these instruments, and we have to see whether that the existence of a residual risk itself is compatible with the existing framework of international human rights law, which does not mean necessarily that, because of course, how can you totally eliminate the risk? Still, it is important to be aware of the fact that perhaps changes in order for the 2 regimes of international human rights law and possibly this new regime of regulation of artificial intelligence needs to be made in order to make them compatible. Such a risk assessment procedure should involve a human rights due diligence process. It is the entire framework of risk assessment of human rights is in a way a human rights due diligence process, but the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union in a report that dealt precisely with the use of this technology, warned about the fact that for such a due diligence process to actually be effective, it must be performed by authorities that have a specific competence on human rights, other than a specific competence on the technology. This is just to tell you that these kind of problems are not new in the realm of human rights, because from a conceptual standpoint, they recall very much problems that are already being addressed with regards to the regime of business and human rights, corporate social responsibility, and human rights obligations on the part of states in those fields where we have states and private and big corporations working together. Another point with regards to fundamental rights is the classification of artificial intelligence, of some artificial intelligence systems as unacceptable or as high risk. What happened is that in the months that preceded the adoption of the regulation proposal, there was a big movement on the part of civil society organizations calling for a complete ban of biometric identification and categorization system. This was not welcomed entirely by the Commission, meaning that just real-time remote biometric identification system in publicly accessible spaces for the purposes of law enforcement are considered unacceptable. And even in this case, we have exceptions that are allowed for, while all other AI systems that intend to be used for real-time and post-remote biometric identification of natural persons are inserted within the category of high-risk artificial intelligence, which means that they are allowed into the market as long as they pass the assessment and the certification procedures. There have been developments in these very days, because 2 days ago, the European Parliament adopted a resolution that is much stricter than the proposal by the Commission with regards to biometric systems, calling for a ban on facial recognition technologies to pool. So we will see how much this will influence the subsequent draft of the regulation. Just another point is that as for high-risk artificial intelligence, that, as we said, are the main object of the regulation, what is provided for is a conformity assessment procedure. It is a very complex system that requires artificial intelligence tools providers to establish a quality management system, to operate a conformity assessment, and to produce a EU declaration of conformity. After this process, they can affix the CE marking of conformity on the AI tool. There are 7 authorities that will be involved in this process: national competent authorities, a European coordination board, and much of the negotiations in this moment regard how much power will be given to the national authority and how much to the EU centralized coordination authority. To be noted from a human rights perspective is that even for Highrisk AI, in the end, all that the regulation requires is a self-assessment procedure, and the involvement of an external authority to the AI provider is required just for high-risk AI systems that are used for biometric identification. For all other artificial intelligence tools, in the end, what we are talking about as for high-risk AI is a self-assessment procedure, of course, under the supervision of this European Coordination Board and national authorities, but whose functions have yet to be specifically detailed because they are the object of these negotiations among the state party. Conceptually, we must say that this entire model very much draw inspiration from European Union product safety law. Indeed, in the end, what will be done is to affix a CE marking of conformity on the AI tool. And from the, let's say, human rights community, the question that arises is whether this is really the most appropriate regime and the most appropriate standard from which to drive lessons learned to be applied and to establish this regulation of artificial intelligence. As we all know, negotiations are still ongoing and much can still change. Just another thing that I want to note is that with everything that regards to the respect of human rights, we must look at not only the European Union framework, but also the Council of Europe framework, because the European Convention of Human Rights is an act that is not within the European Union regime, but the Council of Europe regime. And that is the most effective human rights instrument we have so far, because it has a court, the European Court of Human Rights. So in this very moment, the CAI, the Committee on Artificial Intelligence of the Council of Europe, opened a public consultation precisely in order to work on a regulatory framework on artificial intelligence from a human rights perspective. We have to have a close look at that process, because it can end up perhaps in a new additional protocol to the European Convention of Human Rights, or anyway in a document that can have actual, let's say, execution and enforcement, because it would be part of a system that has a proper court. So that's it from my side.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know, I mean, I would make even though we are if you don't mind, what I propose, since we are a bit late, and you are saying, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we delay questions to the discussion, and now we'll move on with the program.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so keep your questions for later, or if you are going to leave this workshop, maybe you want to ask something to Federica. Okay. Okay, so next speaker, Professor Daniele Nardi. Daniele Nardi is okay. So Daniele Nardi is full professor of computer science, artificial intelligence at the University of Rome La Sapienza. He is the director of the National Laboratory on Artificial Intelligence and Intelligent Machine. I mean, he was one of the pioneering researchers in artificial intelligence. I personally met during my course of study when he was very young, and started teaching at Sapienza. So I asked Daniele to, in fact, comment from the methodological point of view, the impact and also the approach of this proposal in defining, first of all, so the proposal tries to define artificial intelligence, but defining it through, I mean, by defining a system of AI, meaning saying that a system of artificial intelligence is everything that makes use of some methodologies like machine learning, deep learning, neural network. So I don't know, it's difficult to define, but I think you are the most appropriate person to clarify this. Are we? Just a few seconds. This might take several minutes. Okay.
Okay. First of all, I want to say that in the last days after Marilena asked me to do this, to give this talk, I've been complaining to her a lot because it's something that I'm really unfamiliar with. And reading a law is an exercise that, in the end, finally, I think I might also to thank her, because eventually I did look into it. So I essentially, differently from what she said, I've been really reading the act and trying to understand whether there are any implications from the methodological standpoint. Methodological, I mean, just from my point of view of a researcher, maybe with some additional remark as a citizen, not certainly with the competence in the subject, in the legislation or anything like that. So clearly the first point is the definition of AI. Okay, we start our course saying, well, there are multiple definitions of AI. And in fact, it's, you know, either thinking like human, acting like human, acting rationally, thinking rationally. This is what the book, the textbook presents. Then when I saw personally this definition, which is from the expert group, there is one thing, which is some degree of autonomy. I think this is very difficult to characterize in general, let alone for a legislation, right? If we use our car, my favorite example, you have the ABS. When you push the pedal on the brake, it's not under your control. There is an underlying system which controls it. And by the way, it used to be done with control techniques, and now it's done with deep learning. So different models, completely different models. And by the way, I don't think control is listed among the techniques. There is optimization, but not control. And then the other thing, which I think is relevant, and I really don't find much in the act, is the distinction between virtual and physical, which definitely makes a difference in terms of technical and I think also non-technical issues. Okay. So what do they say, in fact? Well, first of all, let me remark that in the introduction, there is this interesting thing that stakeholders, they say that they want a good definition of AI, good definition of risk. I mean, this is a key point. And then the idea is to be technology neutral. This is the aim. And here is the definition. Okay, the definition essentially sends to just a set of techniques. An AI system, essentially, as I understand it, is a system which is implemented with one of the techniques that I'll show you in a second that are specified in Annex 1. After all, this is the definition that I give in my course. In the end, I say, yes, we are studying a bunch of techniques because we are addressing the same problem that they do in control theory, except that in control theory, they are really focused on one specific model of the problem. Here we have a number of techniques, different, especially in the discrete world, that address the problem. But referring to techniques, I think, from my point of view, was a wise step forward. So here are the techniques. And by the way, it's not only machine learning. And one of the things that I can bring here, since I am old enough, is that many of the issues that are coming up now, that I will talk about, came up also when there was this flourishing of expert systems everywhere, namely in the 80s, which was at the beginning of my career as a researcher. So explainability, it's not a problem just of neural networks. If you take a rule system with thousands of rules and thousands of steps in the derivation, how can you get a meaning out of this, the outcome of the system? So I'm going to go to take it short, but they try to be comprehensive. But for example, as I mentioned earlier, a control model, I don't think it falls in any of these categories. And it can be used, after all, in implementing an intelligent system. We have been talking about this. I want to say just one thing. Thank you for bringing this up. From my point of view, this risk evaluation thing is very important, and once and for all is telling us that it's the question of the potential harm or danger is not in the technology. It's on how the technology is applied. When you consider the risk, you have the probability that something happens and the impact. So we are now talking about the impact of whatever is implemented using one of the technologies. Here are the unacceptable risk systems. I wonder why they're saying this only for AI systems. I don't understand. Anything that is subliminal, the technique beyond the person consciousness that does something bad, I mean, why it should be only AI? I mean, this is very general. And this applies to any of these domains that are excluded because they are unacceptable. So we're talking about impact here. Then we end to this high-risk AI system, which is the core of the legislation, because it's where the law is prescribing a number of things. And if you look at this list, we have already heard about biometric identification. I'm not going to say anything more. Of course, management and operation of any critical infrastructure is another domain. And I think for these domains, there are, at least for the critical infrastructure, additional pieces of legislation that handle them. But if you look at all the other lists, which is education, employment, access to private services, essential private services, law enforcement, migration, administration of justice, the issue is fairness. Behind all of this list, the main problem actually is non-discrimination. Okay? Because for education, the point that they make in the as far as I can read, please tell me if I am mistaken or on any of these points. In this education, it's about grading or about selecting. It's all about creating potential discriminations among or on an essential service. Okay. So what can we say about discrimination? How can discrimination be assessed? Well, typically, we look at a problem from a data analysis, statistical point of view, and we have to consider bias. I'm sure you know all the examples of systems that are biased on gender, on race, on different things, right? And the bias can come from data or can even come from interpretation of data. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I want to point out that from a research point of view, bias mitigation is one of the hot issues. There are lots of good researchers working on this. So in a sense, this has already been taken care from the point of view of the research and the research approach. But fairness is not only a technical issue. In the end, we are resorting to consider fairness from the point of view of evaluation of the system. Once you have a system, you want to determine whether it is fair, and in order to do this, you have to determine fair with respect to what. So you have to choose the variables and decide gender, is this fair with respect to gender? And eventually you may test the system against fairness on one specific variable. But I just ran into this one paper in my little search that I did for presentation. And there is one point, that is many of these variables often require access to demographic data. And there is a privacy issue there. So to what extent one can effectively collect demographic data in order to figure out whether the system is fair or not, it's something that is, I think, needs to be explored. Okay, and in this paper, if you look, they did a survey on a number of companies on what they do about fairness. And it turns out that they go from collecting all the data, which I think is not a good thing, from doing nothing. Okay, so that's these two things, they need to be somewhat better understood and better balanced. And the thing which is at the bottom line, I think that as I said, also at the age of expert systems, they say, well, you don't only need the AI expert, which is going to build the system, but you need the domain expert to give the rules. And the two, they have to interact. And here is the same, you have to have the domain expert and in addition, something that at the time was not really considered, you have to have someone who understands the ethics of the problem, of the application, of the domain. Okay, I've learned this ethicist as a term. I think that like the GPR as the responsible for the data, for the AI, they should be the responsible for the ethics, I think. And so the engineering of these systems, which means really put them into practice, really requires a lot more beyond a clever technical solution. Okay, so research can help, but in the end, this reminds me of the situation where you want to check the correctness of programs. You have beautiful approaches based on program synthesis, theorem proving, but they cover a minor part of the testing that is done of the program. So even though there may be good mathematical results on the statistics, and that they will certainly bring an additional value. But my impression is that in the end, there is going to be a specific dedicated testing for this system, and the testing methodologies are all to be addressed. In this title 3, we have Article 14, which says something about overseen by natural persons, which was also one of the principles, right? So it's a key point. What does this mean? This means that we have to have systems that are interpretable, whose results, outcomes are interpretable by humans. Okay? And this is, again, I already mentioned, this is not new. Even in the old time, without an understanding of why, how the solution came up. And again, there is a large body of research in AI, which is about explainability, how to generate explanations of decisions, and they can be by design, black box, models that are more transparent than others, and there is a lot there. And I'm not, again, actually, Fabrizio will be talking about this. Thank you, Fabrizio. But just from my point of view, my analysis, I think it's, research is already addressing this issue at large. Finally, finally, almost, I still have a couple of minutes. So nothing surprising concerning accuracy, robustness, and cybersecurity, except that robustness, I don't know. I don't think we have good approaches to robustness at this time. So robustness is something that needs to be investigated also from a technical standpoint. And cybersecurity is a little bit aside of the core AI business, so to speak. There is also a mention of resilience. I mean, resilience, as far as I understand, means restart after a crash. It's a post-disaster. I don't really understand what they mean here. Sorry, maybe we can talk about it later. What is more interesting from my point of view is that this is very different from any other system that's been seen on Earth until now, is that machine learning systems can change their behavior based on new input as they go. So what does it mean that a system can be, is fair? It's fair now. Maybe it becomes unfair after a number of, or anything, performance can degrade or improve, it depends. So that's a very basic issue that is also important for the research community. And testing and certification, I mean, this is all things that need to come. We need to have them. But they will be complex, in particular, because we have to go beyond the performance measures that are referred to the data set used for training. And also the system, the AI component is also part of an embedded of a larger system. And so the testing of this larger system. There is very little to say about transparency, and it's been already said. So they have to be transparent, but this is not the responsibility of AI methodologies or anything like that. Transparency is up to providers and users. So Finally, my conclusions. I mean, it's very good to have a legislation, first of all, because it clarifies a number of issues, in particular about the danger of AI. It's not AI that is dangerous by itself, okay? It's the domain that makes it dangerous or good for the society. The second point is that, as far as I understand, I did not mention privacy here because it's been covered and it's covered in other acts. Many of the things are covered elsewhere, not in this act. But as far as some of the challenges that are clear, fairness, interpretability, and here I should put continuous learning, they are already addressed by the scientific community. And what is really needed is a substantial step in AI engineering, so creating methodologies that put on the market certified systems. And this will require standards. And before closing, I just want to point out that as a lab, we are here in the exhibit with RIM, and it's a pleasure for me that we are there together. And I hope that this will be a starting point for a stronger collaboration. But visit the exhibit because it's very nice.
Thank you, Daniele. Very interesting. Many things, and then there is, you know, the point of departure for discussion. I apologize with the attendees, remote attendees, but I couldn't read the chat, so for the speakers unable to talk, please, if you see something that does not work properly, just speak. No? In any case, Daniele, we can make the slides available. Yes. Okay. Are you staying, or so we ask questions now? Okay. So then Fabrizio, now, yeah, thank you. Fabrizio is also full professor of computer science at our department at Sapienza, same department as me and Daniele, and he will talk about explainability of AI.
All right, can you see the slides? Just to make sure. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, it's okay.
Yes, we can.
All right, cool. All right, so first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. Actually, when I got the invitation, I had to, you know, to do a sort of a couple of back and forths with
Fabrizio. So
yeah?
I'm sorry, just 1 second, because we have a problem here in the room and we can't see you, but it's a problem of the projector. Yeah, now we can. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So as I was saying, I was kind of interested in understanding a little bit better what was expected from a presentation, let's say, on explainability in AI in a, you know, on the context of this workshop. And so as Daniele said at the beginning, I thought that it would have been good to actually give a little bit more details on why explainability is important, and also how this can be done. I mean, one of the things that maybe it's good to point out is that in my past life, meaning up to 1 year ago, I was actually working as a researcher scientist in industry at the beginning at Yahoo Research and then Facebook AI. So these two experiences that I'm going to show are actually coming from real world examples. So I don't think I need to convince you that explainability, it's actually very, very important in AI. Actually, the GDPR already contained, let's say, some kind of kernels of the need, you know, instilling the need for explaining an AI system. And in particular, it is important to make sure that an AI system I mean, when an AI system takes a decision, it should be also possible to communicate why the decision has been taken for several reasons. I mean, transparency one, but also to avoid possible problems. For instance, you have a bug in your system, you want to understand, where the bug is, and the explanations can be helpful in that. So what's explainable AI? Well, I like to show this comic when I start this kind of talks, because it's actually fun, and it actually captures the essence of AI. I mean, you look at the map and you read, okay, you are here, but maybe you might be interested in why you're here, right? And so this why question actually resulted in a plethora of many different ways of explaining a model, or even making model interpretable. The difference between explainability and interpretability is that explainability is post hoc, that is, you do take a decision and then you explain the decision. Instead, interpretability means that you look at the model and you can understand why decisions are taken. So in one case, we also speak about explaining the black box, which means you have a model that you cannot interpret. You cannot look at it and say, okay, I'm going to take this decision because of these variables. But instead, you take a decision and then you do some processing on the decision and the model to output an explanation. So in these particular examples, I want to focus on a particular kind of explanations, which is the so-called counterfactual explanations. And the example is, you go to a doctor and you show them your blood analysis and you ask, will I have diabetes? This is one of the most common examples. And the doctor actually says yes or no, and it gives you an explanation. But if you ask to typically, if you ask to an AI system, it will only tell you yes or no without giving you any possible explanation. So what is counterfactual explanation is, the system will not only tell you yes or no, but will also tell you how you should change, in this case, I mean, what habits you should change in order to flip the outcome of the prediction. So if you want to avoid having diabetes, you should increase the exercise level, and you should decrease the fat level, right? So this is called counterfactual explanations. And within this let's say, framework, we have done a couple of works. So this was done when I was at Yahoo Research, and we had a model for advertisement that was based on this model that is called ensembles of decision trees. But it doesn't really matter the model, the kind of model. The fact is that the model was really black box, meaning you cannot really understand. The model consists in a sequence of models that themselves are interpretable, but the ensemble is not. So we actually have also a patent on this and a publication. So this is it's a nice example where industry is giving back what they are doing to the academic community. And I mean, the thing is that we really wanted to open the black box. And for this kind of models, we actually were able to go from a series of trees, as you can see in this case, to a sort of set of rules that could be taken to decide how to change the input in order to flip the prediction, the outcome. And we did that, as I said, in the context of an advertisement product. And in particular, the product was measuring the quality of advertisement. So in this case, the user was the advertiser, and they were proposing some advertisements. And before the advertisement was allowed to be shown to users, we ran some quality classifiers. So the advertisers were not happy when we got back to them and say, hey, look, we cannot show your advertisement because it doesn't meet our quality standards. So they wanted also an explanation. And this is what we did. And so we told them how to change the advertisement in order to meet our standard advertisement criteria. Sorry, quality criteria. And this was done in an automatic way. We actually asked a team of people we had at Yahoo to evaluate the quality of the suggestions, and the suggestions were really, really, really good, meaning they were able to operate with this suggestion and to increase the quality of the advertisement without hurting the user experience. The second example comes from a different experience. This is done when I was at Facebook AI. And there, as you can imagine, Facebook is a social network, as you all know, and the kind of structure of the data they have is, in computer science, we call it a graph. Basically, is a sort of, you can think of a graph as a connection of data, as a set of data that are connected among themselves. So a social network is a set of users, people that are connected by friendships, relationships. So in some cases, we were taking decisions on nodes, for instance, on posts that were done on Facebook on the basis of the structure. And we were not, so those decisions were actually kind of delicate decisions. For instance, taking down a post because it contained COVID misinformation. And when we were taking down a post, we should have been ready to explain why we did that. So, again, we were using a very state-of-the-art model to do that, to take that kind of decisions, which are nowadays known as graph neural networks. And the idea was to understand by, say, looking at the connections between data, why the model outputted an explanation. And of course, you wanted to suggest, let's say, to a user that maybe some of the connections caused the decision to be made. And that was, again, a counterfactual explanation, because the counterfact is if you didn't have this connection, your prediction would have been different. The output would have been different. And another requirement was to keep the number of, let's say, connections that you want to observe, that you want to put in the explanation, as small as possible. And this plot actually shows that, okay, in the very large majority of the cases, we were able to suggest, to pick only one connection to explain the whole relationship. So I want to get to the conclusion by saying essentially that, in my opinion, of course I'm biased, but in my opinion, explanation in AI is one of the most important topics that are up there. So there are lots of works. If you look at the number of research papers that have been published in the last, say, couple of years on explanations, the number of papers is like exponentially increasing. And actually, we started working on this topic well before it was hot. And I'm very glad that it's now becoming important and people are aware of it. And also, like the AI regulation act that is being proposed by EU is putting a lot of pressure on companies that want to deploy AI tools to actually make them as transparent as possible. And transparent means transparent at various levels, like which kind of data you use to train your model, how the model got to a prediction or a decision, and so on and so forth. There is still a lot of things to do, and actually we are also already working on many interesting additional results. And one exciting direction would be to create a sort of an agent that when let's say an artificial intelligence model is deployed, this autonomous agent could go and explain the model without even knowing which kind of model is, but just looking at the input and the output. So with that, I conclude, and I thank you again. And of course, if you have questions, I will stick around to answer them.
So thank you, Fabrizio. We have gone home. I don't know if you, let me turn the video on. If you are staying with us till the end of the course, so we do, as for the other speakers, we delay the questions.
All right.
So there is the coffee break open, but I propose to just to keep on track with the schedule to let Andrea Zanchettin talk about embodied AI, and then we will have a short break. Okay, so we will conclude this part of description, making the point of the technology somehow. Andrea, thank you very much. Andrea is associate professor of Politecnico di Milano in robotics, and his main research interests are, among the others, human-robot interaction, intelligent human-robot interaction, but physical. This time we have, is where AI gets physical. And so, thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you, Marilena, and also Riccardo for the invitation. So just to check, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
yes, please.
So I will start sharing the screen. Just let me know when you see slides.
We do.
Okay, so okay, now you should see at full screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you again for the invitation. So as you have anticipated, my talk will be around embodied AI. So we will further understand what I mean, because that is not probably a standard term to refer to a field of research. But before we do, I would like just to show you what we do in the lab. So that starts from some kind of motivation or contextualization of our recent research work. So you see already that there's an artificial intelligent technology here, but just let go straight to the demonstration. So what you see here is a human and a robot. So and just stop the video for a while. You see here a human and a robot. Those are the human basically is captured from a camera on top, which is not visible here, but here you see what the system sees about the human. And the system is able to classify apples from background and human hands and store data regarding those two things and tell the robot what to do accordingly. So in this case, you see that at the beginning, the robot sees the apples, then decides which one has to be picked up from the table. But then something happens, as particularly the human is going to go very close to the target of the robot, so the robot is not able to pick it. So it has to decide what to do instead. In the second run, you see that the robot would like to take an apple, but the same apple is taken by the human instead. So the robot has to decide what else to be performed, what else action to be performed. So you see that there is some kind of interaction between, I would say, three systems, but actually there are two systems. So one is the human, the other one is the body of the robot. The other system is the artificial intelligence that is used both for perception, as we use a state-of-the-art technique, which is YOLO, deep neural network, and another neural network that is used for predicting human movements so to let robot to decide what to do next. So we have this kind of integrated system that use AI perception and decision-making mechanism to allow the interaction between a physical entity, which is the human, and another physical entity, which is the robot. So this is more or less the framework where I do some research together, of course, with students and PhD students. So when I had a look into the document from the European Commission, well, I first went through the Annex 1 that was mentioning the approaches that are covered behind this umbrella, and I would like to thank already previous speakers that have already mentioned those 3 bullet points, I would say. So the Annex 1 is telling that regulations apply to traditional machine learning approaches, so from unsupervised, supervised reinforcement towards deep learning. And then the second part is, I would call it the good old-fashioned AI, which is logic, knowledge-based approaches, expert systems, and so on, but also something that is, I would say, not very focused, not very related to what we regard as AI, which is statistics, basically, Bayesian optimization, but also search algorithms that are probably part of the good old-fashioned AI, but also optimization methods. And here I would also include automatic control, because in the end, defining a control law is some kind of optimization technique to select the action to be performed. So it's a very big set of topics, research topics and technologies. And this is something that it's probably too vague in the definition, especially with the last bullet point, as it is basically including most of the engineering fields. I would take some time here, because I didn't see anyone before me actually taking some historical developments of research in AI. So we started with those 2 first bullet points. One is the symbolic part, and the other one is the data-driven, I would say. And I made this chart just to show that those 2 were basically interleaved with respect to time. So we started as the first work probably after the 50s, where the work on neural networks, so in particular one brick of neural networks, which is the perceptron. And then also more or less in the same time, we started looking at symbolic AI, or the good old-fashioned AI, approximately in the 60s. So on top, you see the knowledge or symbolic AI. On bottom, you see the development of neural networks, basically. And you see how the history went since then. So we had the first problem, recognizing that a very simple neural network was not able to mimic the output of a XOR problem. So it is not able to distinguish 2 different inputs. And that was basically confusing the researchers on that. So they stopped basically looking at neural networks for a while. And then in the meanwhile, the problem that is called Block's word popped in. That is probably the one most related to robotics. So the task there is to stack boxes on top of each other, starting from an initial condition towards a final condition using some kind of reasoning method or a search algorithm. And then we had some kind of winter in between. Then the expert systems that were symbolically reasoning based on knowledge rules actually popped up at the start of the 80s. And there was much hype on that. And then after that, more or less 6 years later, then the backpropagation algorithms popped in, which basically allowed researchers to focus on more complicated networks, basically solving the XOR problem by just in more layers. And that is probably the beginning of complicated networks like deep learning, for example. But as it comes with robotics, there is a fundamental problem that at that time, and we are talking about the late 80s, basically, artificial intelligence was not meant to be deployed in real world, or basically, if you look at the blocks world problem, that was very focused on a simulated environment. So there was no physical agent working on the system and working on the environment, and the system, the simulated system, was not able to include uncertainties both in the perception and in the actuation mechanism. So starting from then, we started focusing on, well, actually not me, but other researchers started focusing on problems, also entailing some physical world where the AI is supposed to act on. So based on that, what we have right now is an AI system that is interacting with the real world, but we are mostly familiar with, for example, with the vocal recognition of our smartphone. So we can ask the smartphone, what's the weather today? And based on the answer, we can take decision. So there are no so much implication on third subjects. So the human in this case is mediating the decision whether or not to take the umbrella, but there's no implication on other people in this example. A second example could be one guy to ask an artificial intelligence system whether a certain person, Mr. Smith in this example, should get the loan. The AI will respond, but still the human might or might not have some mediation on the decision. The problem is whether the human can trust completely the artificial intelligence system or not, but still there is a possibility for human to take other decisions that are not necessarily suggested by the AI. Now we have implications for third subjects, but still the decision can be at least human mediated. However, when we have an artificial intelligence that is embodied, so we have a body, we have a robot that is interacting with the environment, and the body to me is an artificial system interacting physically with an environment, there's no human mediation here. So it's the brain, let's call it brain of the robot, that suggests to the robot what to do, and the robot will do that autonomously without any mediation. And the robot will do that autonomously and interacting with the real environment, saying we are exchanging forces, we are exchanging power or energy, and that might cause additional problems for such systems. And this is what I would call the embodied AI, which is more or less the focus of IRIM, which is the Institute of Intelligent Machines and Robotics and Robots. So according to the intended regulation, those embodiments of AIs are high-risk AIs, according to the proposal for regulation, because they are possibly involving the human, as ultimately we would like robot to share the workspace or the environment with humans, and they are physically interacting with an environment. So I completely agree that those systems can be classified as high-risk AIs. I had to look at the document, and also as Daniele before me has actually highlights, there are 3 or 4 important paragraphs that actually popped up in my mind. One is ex-ante conformity assessment. So basically, we would like to assess the conformity of a high-risk AI system before the deployment. And then there's a lot of mentioning about transparency of AI systems, and the fact that humans should, or network persons, can oversee the functioning of an AI system of high risk, which means again some transparency or some explainability. I had this exercise of looking for keywords in the document, and I've seen that risk is mentioned 440 times, which is nice. So we are regarding this as a possible risk. Human is just mentioned 42 times. Data is mentioned 224 times. Transparency 27, and unfortunately, opportunity just 5 times. So I do believe that AI systems, also high-risk AI systems, are opportunity, and opportunities are far more important than risks. So a possible risk have to be, of course, mitigated, but I would say that opportunity will come first than risk. So if there is an opportunity of using an AI system, then we have to handle the risks, but not vice versa. This said, I try to understand better what kind of applications might be under this umbrella of the proposal of regulation. One is ex-ante conformity. So if we look at how driverless cars are trained today, they're basically learning how to recognize stop signals, for example, by just feeding them with a bunch of data. And in particular, there might be pictures. So one question is, if we train the data, there is, of course, some distribution of data. And of course, we are taking where data are more likely to appear in actual situation. But how about the other unlikely values, which are still possible? Well, there's a drawback. This is a very simple drawback of this approach here that has been presented by researchers. They have been called hackers, but they're not. They're basically saying that if a neural network is trained with the most likely data, there's something happening when the neural network is exposed with some data which was not part of the training set, basically. And basically, the neural network was not able to recognize this as a stop sign just because of those 4 patches applied on that. So that is a problem of ex-ante conformity. So if we want to deploy a system that has this property, how many data, how big set of data we should use for the training session, or before deployment, how can we check whether this situation here is not possible according to the training data we used? That's one problem, I think. Another one is the need for transparency. So a couple of years ago, and in 2016, a team of researchers from Washington universities created this husky versus wolf classifier. And that classifier will add a 90% accuracy. So it was able to classify correctly 90 times over 100. And they tried to explain such an accuracy. And it became evident that looking into the network, looking into the algorithm itself was actually detecting the snow background, the snow in the background, as wolves are basically typically represented in picture within a snow background, while husky are not. So basically, they believed they have created a husky versus wolf classifier, but indeed it was a snow detector. And that is another problem of saying we need transparency. Last but not least, we have the typical problem that is correlation versus causation. So if we go back to the blocks word, but we consider now that the word is open. So what we have there is we might see that there is a high probability of having this past condition given the precondition and whatever happens in the meanwhile to be high. But what can we say regarding the cause of this transition from precondition to post condition as the world is open? Was that the robot responsible for this action? Was that the human responsible for that action? Or another entity that we did not even consider was responsible for that action? Just keep in mind that robots are not conscious of their actions, so they do not the meanings, for example. So concluding, if we would like to use a robot in a real world that is some kind of embodying the AI, we have 4 blocks to think about. One is sensing, the other one is reasoning, then we have taking decisions or control, and then we have actuations. So probably for actuation, we have already a good regulation, which is safety, that is accounting for risks and the degree of risk, also the probability of the risk to show up, and also the possibility to mitigate, so to reduce the impact. For decisions and control, we probably need some more explainability. And for all the others, I would say, and I would stress more, a little bit more, that we need transparency. So we need to understand what's going on each block that we have here. I'm still a bit confused about how sensing could be transparent. As for sensing, as we have seen in the example, we have seen a lot of use of neural networks, which are difficult to be classified as transparent, at least. So for the sensing part, I'm not really sure how to handle the transparency problem. But for the others, probably we have tools to start working on. And that is actually concluding my talk, and I look forward to the question and answer session at the end. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Andrea. Are you staying with us?
Yep.
Okay. So now we have a short coffee break, and then we'll be back. Thanks again for your interest.
Thank you.
And,
see you later.
Yeah, see you later.
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome back to this second part of the workshop. And the next speaker is Emanuela Girardi. Emanuela is also, she has done so many things. The thing that I like most, but this is not, I'm mentioning it in the first place because of my personal preference, but so she's the founder of Pop AI. So, but there is a beyond the fancy name, there is actually an important concept here that is about raising the awareness about AI. So I would say with the slogan like regulation versus education. I don't know if this is appropriate. In any case, she is also a member of the high-level expert group in artificial intelligence of the Italian government. And I think Manuela will also talk about the act and the effect of the act, the impact beyond Europe, right, Manuela? So, well, I let you speak.
Thank you, Marilena. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you also the organization of the RIM2021. I have some slides that I would like to share. I hope it works this time. Let's see if I'm able to do this. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, yeah. And also in the attendees, can they see it? Because before there was a problem. Now I cannot see it anymore, so I hope you can see it.
We can see.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good. So I mean, I'm lucky because the distinguished guests that came before me, they already presented some of the items that I would have discussed. So I can focus more probably on the geopolitical landscape of AI and discuss the different models that there are. So I will start with with the geopolitical landscape. So basically, today almost all the main countries are developing AI strategies around the world and are investing significant resources to bring the benefits of AI into society on one side, and also making sure that the risks are managed and controlled. So we have last year the AI index from Stanford, the Human-Centric AI Institute, published this map, and you can see that basically the blue, the countries, they are the countries which are already 32, are the global countries worldwide that already published an AI strategy. And if you can see the light blue, it's another 22 countries who are developing their AI strategies. And actually, unfortunately, Italy, I mean, we published already 3 strategies, AI strategies, but unfortunately, we still haven't sent it officially to Brussels, to the European Ops, sorry, to the European Commission. And so we are light blue at the moment. But as you can see, I mean, basically, artificial intelligence is considered really the strategic technology of the future. So all the countries around the world are investing a lot in developing these strategies and in bringing the potential huge benefits that it can bring into society, into companies, into the education systems, and so on. So if we look at the, I mean, lots of countries are developing AI strategies, but if we look at the global landscape of AI, basically we can see that there are today 3 main models: the Chinese model, the American model, and the European model. So the Chinese and the American model, they are quite different, but they also have some similarities. Because if we think about that, I mean, both in US and China, the AI innovation is driven by big corporations. And basically they are running business globally, so behind borders, and they are investing huge amount of money in research, and they are also collecting enormous amount of personal data. And they are leading the development of AI globally, basically. But there are some differences. So in the US, there is a strong tendency towards decentralization and deregulation, while in China, the tendency is towards an increasing control of the central government, and we see it more and more often. So if this is the global landscape of AI, what is Europe doing? So Europe is kind of lagging, because Europe started, like we saw with the first presentation by Federica Merenda, that started only in 2018 with the Declaration of Cooperation on AI. And since then, it's focused more on regulating the AI system, like we heard also from the previous speech. And so basically the focus, I would say, of Europe is definitely regulation. But let's have a look, a deeper look at the Chinese and the American system, because if Europe is focusing on regulation, I mean, when they presented the first AI regulation in the world, the AI Act, also China lately started focusing on regulation. So basically at the end of August, the China's Internet Watchdog, so the Cyberspace Administration of China, the CAC, released some draft guidelines on AI that seek to regulate the use of an algorithmic recommender system by Internet Information Services. So this Chinese approach includes some global best practice around algorithm system regulation, such as, the one that have been mentioned before, to promote transparencies or using privacy controls and so on. And so we see that there is a tendency also in regulation in China, but there are also some main concerns about this. And the most important, the higher concerns, I would say, are that basically Chinese government is trying to seek to expand control over the system, how the system are designed and how they're used to curate content. And also it seems like, China's government is trying to expand control over the way these, big corporations are operating and how they're developing their recommender system. And which means that it will increase control over social media companies, e-commerce platforms, ride-sharing services. We heard, we saw the news about Didi and so on in the last weeks. So basically, if this law passed, it means that China's government will increase its control over online information flows. So this could be, this is the main concern. But there is another interesting point about Chinese regulation. Basically, like I think starting from the 1st of November, if I remember well, there will be a new data protection law on the personal information protection law that has been issued. And it's very similar to the GDPR that has been presented also before. And it's trying to regulate the use of personal data by big corporations. And basically what it's doing is that it's kind of forcing these app developer or algorithm developers to ask for consensus to citizens to be able to use and to process their data. And so this is a big change because, I mean, we always think that China, I mean, maybe is lacking some regulation, but there is a strong regulation framework that is coming. Probably, I mean, in some way, it's even stronger than the European one. The big difference is that there is a government control that it's getting probably higher and higher in controlling the corporations and in controlling the data. So this is about China. But very interesting is also this document that I wanted to share with you about US. And this basically this National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. This commission has been set in 2000, it was established in 2018 to make some recommendation to the president and the Congress. And the goal was really, I mean, to advance the development of artificial intelligence technologies. And the interesting thing is that the final report of this commission that has been issued in March 2021 was saying that the US, and this is very interesting, is not sufficiently prepared to defend or compete against China in the AI era. So in this commission, there were, if I remember well, about 10, 15 people, and one of these was also Eric Schmidt, one of the founders of Google and now Alphabet. And the funny, I mean, the interesting thing is like 700 pages. So if you want to read it, it's very, very interesting. But I just highlighted some few key points from this. And what is very interesting is that basically, I mean, according to the results of this long study and research, they decided to dramatically increase non-defense federal spending on AI research and development, and they doubling every year from $2 billion in 2022 to $32 billion in 2026. So this is a huge amount of money that they decided to invest in research in AI. And the other very interesting thing is that they're focusing on education on one side and on talents on the other side. So the second point is the creation of a digital corporation to bring skilled tech workers into government. The third point is founding a digital service academy, so a sort of university that is not only forming people with AI skills, but it's also asking them to work for a time in government. So this is very important to bring the AI skills and knowledge into government services. And the fourth point is that it's also taking care of civil rights and civil liberties. And so it's also considering the risk of AI systems and how to manage this risk, like the European AI regulation. And the last point, which I find it very interesting because it's also related to the brain drain that we are facing in Europe. And basically they are expanding allocation of employment-based green cards and giving them to every AI PhD graduates from an accredited US university. So I think that this is very interesting because US, they've seen that they are lacking some skills and some development in AI, and they're investing huge resources to cover this gap, especially focusing on education and on research. And I think that this is very interesting. And another last point that it's also very interesting, and this is referring to the relationship between Europe and the US, is that there has been a couple of weeks ago, the first meeting of the Trade and Technology Council, and in Pittsburgh, and basically they started working on specific items. So they identified the 10 working groups, and one of these, I mean, not one, but several of these working groups, they are also focusing on AI technologies, and especially in AI standards, because I think that has been mentioned before by Daniele Nardi, AI engineering is very important, and also think it will play a leading role in the AI governance globally, I mean, in the next year. So as you can see, it's a very interesting AI geopolitical landscape. And of course, we have these two main models, China and US, but Europe, even if it was lagging and if it started focusing on cooperation and regulation, it's kind of recovering its position, I think. I think that there are still some gaps that need to be covered. For instance, I mean, huge investment in AI research that, I mean, even if the amount that's been dedicated in the new Digital Europe brain, I mean, they are important, but they are not as important as the amount that we've seen that are invested by China or by US. So the previous speech already presented all the different AI papers that have been released in the last 2 years, 2-3 years by the European Commission. And there are still more to come because there is also the new AI Data Act that will probably be released by the end of this year. We can see that there are really lots of documents. So it's, I mean, it's really obvious that there is a focus on regulation because we started from the Declaration of Cooperation on AI for Europe in April 2018. And then we had the white paper on AI in February 2020, and also the European Data Strategy. And there is really a clear goal, a clear mission of developing a European AI ecosystem when on one side, the legal certainty of that it will be provided by the AI Act, the AI regulation, and on the other side, the need to go, like it's well stated in the new coordinated plan, to go from lab to market. So really to realize this knowledge transfer from the university, the academy, the research into the market, which means to bring it to companies and to society and to government's offices. So I will not stay any longer on these documents because they were being very well presented by the previous speaker. But I think that what is important is the European vision compared to the American and the Chinese one. So the vision of developing this trustworthy human-centric AI. And trustworthy is very important because it means that citizens, I mean, if they, I mean, to be able to use, in order to use this AI system, they need to trust them. They need to trust that the decision that has been taken by these automatic systems are safe for them. And so it's very important basically the definition of this trustworthy human-centric AI that has been presented also very well before by Federica Merenda, and which it's focusing really on these 3 points. What does it mean, trustworthy AI? Trustworthy AI means that they need to be, these systems, they need to be lawful, so they need to respect the rule of laws and fundamental rights. They need to be ethical, so they need to be aligned with the ethical principles and ethical standards that we have in Europe. And we have heard the previous speakers talking about transparency, talking about fairness, explicabilities, human agency and oversight. And these are really very, very important to define trustworthy AI. And the last one, which is also equally important, is to develop robust AI, which means robustness from the technical and also from the social point of view, which means at the end that they need to be safe for people. But the other important thing of the European vision of AI is this human-centric AI. So what does it mean? It means that we need to develop artificial intelligence technologies to improve people's life, to support people's life. So they will never be a substitute of a human being, but they will improve people's life. I think this is a very important point. But it's not enough because I think that human-centric today, it's quite limited. I mean, if we think about the challenges that we're facing today, like the climate changes or the environmental changes and so on, I think that it's, I mean, a human-centric approach is not enough. We need to adopt a planet-centric approach because at the end, I mean, as human beings, we're just part of these ecosystems. And so we really need to start thinking that we're not the center, but we are part of the entire ecosystem. And we really need to put the planet hearts at the center. And we need to develop AI technologies that improve the life of all human species. And we are just part of it. it. So I think that this sort of paradigm shift is very important, and also at European level is very important. And if we think about the first release of the AI regulation that was kind of leaked last January, it's what is important is that it was including also among the high risk systems, among the high risk AI system, also the environmental risk. And this thing has been then removed, but probably it will be under discussion, and I'm quite confident it will be included also in the final part. Because, I mean, if we're on one hand, we're developing the Green Deal, I mean, we also have to make sure that we have a coherent strategy. And so this part should be included also in the AI Regulation Act. This is at least, of course, my opinion. So we already seen the presentation of the proposal for a European AI regulation and the horizontal risk approach. These 4 different risk categories, from unacceptable to high risk, limited and minimal risk. Since it was very well presented, I will just focus on the high risk, especially on the high risk for companies. So we have to consider that in Europe, most of the companies, they are small and medium enterprise. And if you think about Italy, most of them, they are micro business, so they have less than 10 employees. So if we see about the high risk obligations that a company, they have to be compliant with if they want to bring into the market an AI risk, AI system that it's considered high risk. I mean, there are really lots of obligations, because the AI Act requires high risk systems to be trained on data sets that are complete, representative, and free of errors, implemented on traceable and auditable systems in transparent manner, subject to human oversight at all times, robust, accurate, and secure. So if I am an AI system provider of a system that is considered high risk, I need to do lots and lots of activities to be compliant. So I must build a quality management system, maintain detailed technical documentation, conduct an assessment to ensure that the AI system conforms to the AI Act, register the system in the new EU database that will be developed, monitor the system once it's in the market, update the documentation of the conformity system if there are some changes, and there are probably some changes because the training is changing and the system is learning, and then collaborate with market surveillance authorities. So, I mean, all these activities, of course, if you think about a small and medium, especially a small enterprise, I mean, they're very costly. So very interesting is this analysis that has been performed by the Center for Data Innovation last July. And they try to estimate the cost for a European AI ecosystem, and also the cost for a small and medium enterprise to bring into the market the system. And consider that most of these companies, they still have to perform the digitalization of their process. So, I mean, they know also that there are big opportunities for AI system that they can, to bring AI system into their companies, but they're also kind of anxious because, I mean, they see all these requirements and they don't know if they can fulfill these requirements. So this study by the Center for Data Innovation said that globally, the AI Act will cost the European economy about 30 billion euro over the next 5 years. And it will reduce the investments of AI in Europe by 20%. So, I mean, of course, we can discuss how this study was performed, but I mean, even if there are, I mean, more limited figures, it's a very high cost. And if we look at the small and medium enterprises, especially as a medium or a small enterprise, basically they say that the cost of compliance will be up to 400,000 euros, which will cause profit to decline by 40%. So this is the situation, and then the Commission says that it wants 75% of European business to use AI by the end of this decade. And if we see the current figures, sorry, it's about 28% at the moment. So I think that there is, I mean, there are lots of opportunities, and I was very impressed by the figure that Andrea Zanchetin presented, that the word opportunity is mentioned only 5 times in the AI Act, and the word risk 440 times. So I think that the real point, and I'm going to conclude, is to find the balance between, I mean, on one hand, to develop a regulation that can foster a safe development of AI systems and that can ensure a sort of legal certainty in Europe and protect European citizens. But on the other side, we also need to find a way, I mean, to make sure that, I mean, we can foster the uptake of AI systems in Europe and develop a safe European AI ecosystem. So this balance is really the key. And I think that we cannot find it alone in Europe. So I really think that probably, I mean, the leading role of Europe in this case should be to promote a sort of a global cooperation and discussion about AI governance, and really to try to find a global and to define together a global framework on AI governance, really, I mean, to make sure that we can on one side enjoy the amazing opportunities, on the other side we can manage the risk in a sort of planet-centric way, I would say. I conclude. I think that, I mean, there are, since there are also lots of other, stop sharing, okay, other speech after mine that will address also these points. And if you have any questions, I will be, of course, happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manuela. We move rapidly to the next speaker because we are really late. Is Giacomo Bottos, to whom we asked. Giacomo is director of Pandora, which is an online and also a journal that goes on paper, right? He's a philosopher and journalist, and the Pandora is take particular attention to the innovation and what is going on in the current society, right? Giacomo, may I ask you to, if possible, to shorten your presentation because this will leave some room for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Ok. Mi scuso, innanzitutto presenterò in italiano. E ringrazio molto per l'invito, mi fa molto piacere, e anche ho tratto molti spunti interessanti dalle presentazioni che sono venute prima della mia. Sulla nostra rivista noi ci siamo occupati di intelligenza artificiale in diverse occasioni. Negli ultimi 2 numeri il tema è stato affrontato, tra l'altro anche alcuni dei presenti in questa occasione hanno contribuito al numero piattaforme, che è il penultimo, e anche invece nell'ultimo numero dedicato alle frontiere della scienza e della tecnologia abbiamo toccato il tema, e spero che anche in futuro ci sarà occasione di affrontarlo anche più specificamente. Io appunto cercherò di essere breve, come è stato richiesto. E il dibattito sugli effetti sociali e politici dell'intelligenza artificiale è un dibattito complesso che include tanti aspetti, dal mercato del lavoro alle interazioni sociali, alla sfera pubblica. In parte è un dibattito che prosegue quello che è stato il dibattito negli ultimi anni sull'impatto sociale della digitalizzazione, però ovviamente presenta anche delle caratteristiche ulteriori e a sé. È un discorso che non può che avere comunque una natura in parte ipotetica, non solo perché ci troviamo di fronte a processi che hanno sicuramente un tasso importante di imponderabilità, che è legato alla velocità dei processi, ma anche a delle caratteristiche specifiche delle tecnologie di cui stiamo parlando, tecnologie appunto con una componente di autonomia. Ma l'altra ragione è che non esiste un unico scenario possibile. Come è alla base dello stesso approccio delle istituzioni europee e dell'atto di cui stiamo discutendo oggi, l'intelligenza artificiale ha il potenziale di apportare grandi miglioramenti alla vita delle persone, ma anche di presentare rischi importanti. Ecco, il mix tra questi 2 elementi, tra i rischi e le opportunità, dipende molto anche dalle scelte che si stanno prendendo e che verranno prese. In questo ovviamente la partita della regolazione è ovviamente centrale, e quindi ovviamente la proposta di regolamento di cui stiamo discutendo ha un ruolo fondamentale nel definire le caratteristiche che avrà il modello di AI che verrà affermandosi e quindi anche gli impatti, ma al tempo stesso questa regolazione è solo un elemento comunque di un processo complessivo in divenire. Questa consapevolezza è presente, diciamo, nello stesso regolamento e come abbiamo visto anche nell'intervento precedente, questo contribuisce a definire le caratteristiche dell'ecosistema europeo, che è uno dei 3 grandi ecosistemi insieme a quello di Stati Uniti e Cina, in cui con caratteristiche in parte diverse si sta sviluppando la realtà dell'intelligenza artificiale. Ecco, partirei dicendo quali sono, diciamo, i possibili rischi e quindi quale può essere, diciamo, uno scenario negativo, appunto, che non necessariamente si verificherà, non necessariamente può verificarsi, che però è utile tenere presente appunto come ciò che va evitato impostando appunto dei percorsi e degli scenari alternativi. Ecco, il rischio appunto è che alcune tendenze negative che comunque sono state osservate negli ultimi anni, nell'ultimo decennio in particolare, legate alla digitalizzazione, conoscano un'accelerazione, conoscano un'intensificazione. Queste tendenze sono l'accrescimento delle diseguaglianze e quindi il rischio che, in considerazione anche della concentrazione attuale degli attori principali del settore tecnologico, gli algoritmi di intelligenza artificiale rappresentino uno strumento estremamente potente che abbia il risultato appunto di consolidare la posizione dominante di questi soggetti, quindi tendendo a aumentare una divaricazione. Legato a questo c'è un rischio di polarizzazione, ad esempio nel mercato del lavoro. Negli ultimi anni appunto abbiamo osservato una tendenza alla creazione di un dualismo tra un segmento ad alto contenuto di conoscenza di lavori e invece una fascia di lavori non qualificati. È possibile, ma appunto assolutamente non necessario, le cose potrebbero andare diversamente, che questa tendenza prosegua e venga accresciuta. Ad esempio vediamo adesso con tutto il dibattito che c'è sui lavoratori che svolgono il ruolo di addestramento dell'intelligenza artificiale, il riconoscimento delle immagini e così via. Legato a questo a sua volta c'è il tema della crisi in un qualche modo del ceto medio, perché alcuni dei settori fondamentali in cui interviene l'intelligenza artificiale, dal settore legale al credito, all'ambito medico, al giornalismo, sono in un qualche modo tradizionalmente appannaggio appunto di quel genere di lavori di qualità che erano propri di appunto di questa fascia sociale, e senza necessariamente ipotizzare uno scenario di sostituzione, comunque ci sono vari fattori che possono portare, diciamo, a una pressione a ribasso in questo settore. E poi il punto forse più importante, il rischio della cristallizzazione delle differenze. In un qualche modo trovandoci di fronte a un modello che si basa su un apprendimento basato su dati e quindi su uno stock di informazioni che derivano dal passato, no? Il rischio appunto in ambiti come il credito, le assicurazioni, le assunzioni, quindi le decisioni sul mercato del lavoro, si rischia in un qualche modo di cristallizzare le differenze sociali e in un qualche modo di fare in modo che il passato diventi un qualcosa che poi viene riprodotto, e quindi legato a questo un blocco dell'ascensore sociale, tutto il tema delle discriminazioni che è molto presente appunto nella proposta di regolamento della Commissione, e poi un ultimo tema che fa parte in un qualche modo, anche questa è una cosa che abbiamo osservato molto negli ultimi anni, ma che potrebbe eventualmente essere accentuato, e fa parte in un qualche modo degli effetti possibili, ma anche è significativo per quanto riguarda la soluzione, il tema della disgregazione della sfera pubblica. Abbiamo osservato le tendenze alla polarizzazione, alla costruzione di echo chambers e quindi la difficoltà crescente di impostare un dialogo costruttivo di approfondimento sulle grandi questioni. Ecco, e appunto questo è una criticità anche in relazione alla soluzione del problema, perché proprio perché non c'è un'unica strada, non c'è un unico approccio, non c'è un unico scenario appunto di declinare l'intelligenza artificiale, sarebbe estremamente importante avere un dibattito approfondito il più largo possibile su quelli che possano essere gli scenari possibili e su come, diciamo, facilitarli. Ecco, in che misura la proposta della Commissione affronta questi rischi? Li affronta in parte, c'è la consapevolezza di alcuni di questi rischi e probabilmente, ovviamente, al netto della discussione che è in corso, che proseguirà, come è stato evidenziato bene da molti degli interventi, e quindi ovviamente bisognerà vedere quale sarà lo sviluppo di questo dibattito rispetto a una serie di nodi critici che sono stati evidenziati, come la questione del self-assessment e le diverse eccezioni rispetto alle pratiche vietate, però al netto di questo sicuramente la proposta fornisce una sorta di rete protettiva rispetto alle peggiori conseguenze possibili in relazione a questi ambiti che sono stati detti, però diciamo sulla base di questa, oltre a questo, poi anche nello spirito in un qualche modo della proposta, poi molto è lasciato all'effettivo sviluppo del settore in un dialogo appunto tra industria, istituzioni e io appunto sottolineerei anche questo elemento della società civile, del dibattito pubblico, che secondo me è molto importante per sollevare anche temi come quelli che a cui in parte ho accennato, che sono temi su cui probabilmente ci possono anche essere sensibilità e posizioni diverse, e quindi sarebbe importante che fossero discussi. Ecco, quindi la proposta della Commissione in un qualche modo proprio dichiaratamente si propone appunto di porre dei requisiti minimi, cito, necessari per affrontare i rischi e i problemi collegati all'intelligenza artificiale, e però appunto poi lascia spazio per una discussione, un dibattito. È molto importante l'individuazione la classificazione nei settori ad alto rischio di alcuni degli ambiti che possono influire più direttamente sui temi a cui accennavo prima, cioè appunto ad esempio le applicazioni relative alla formazione e quindi alla valutazione in ambito educativo, alla selezione e la gestione del lavoro, la concessione del credito e quindi i rischi di discriminazione, le prestazioni e i servizi di assistenza pubblica. Questi sono tutti temi che sono profondamente legati al rischio di impatto sociale, ma anche l'amministrazione della giustizia, la gestione delle politiche di migrazione, le attività di contrasto e riconoscimento biometrico. Ecco, quindi il tema della fiducia è un tema molto importante e cardine in qualche modo della strategia europea. All'interno di questo ecosistema di fiducia io pongo l'accento appunto sulla necessità di costruire anche, di inserire anche questo elemento di dibattito e di discussione. Da questo punto di vista fondamentale è il nodo della conoscibilità e della spiegabilità, della trasparenza, della possibilità di sorveglianza, che sono precondizioni appunto perché questo tipo di esercizio possa affermarsi e diffondersi. Quindi io a questo punto vado verso la conclusione, e quindi la proposta di regolamento, al netto dei punti da discutere, rappresenta un buon punto di partenza che pone un limite, segnala gli ambiti più rischiosi nello sviluppo dell'intelligenza artificiale. Le questioni da valutare sono i due ambiti di valutazione, a mio avviso sono principalmente due, cioè se il meccanismo di valutazione sarà adatto effettivamente ad evitare questi rischi, e se per quanto riguarda le questioni più propriamente legate all'impatto sociale ci sarà uno spazio appunto per porre e discutere ulteriormente queste problematiche in relazione ovviamente alla questione dell'etica di cui si è parlato, ma anche ad altri di questi aspetti che ho sollevato, e appunto certamente in vista di questo le questioni della spiegabilità e della conoscibilità sono questioni appunto determinanti e precondizioni perché si possa avere una discussione sul tema. Grazie.
Thank you very much. So we move rapidly to the next speaker, is Angelo Cianciosi. Angelo is a representative of the entrepreneurial world. He's CEO of MG Research. As an associate of our Centro Studi and Privacy Nova Technology, so as a NOST, I'm asking him to
be very quick, rapid, and
exactly. I know you can.
yes, you know.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so what we'll try to do is we'll skip some of the pages because many of the speakers before me have already addressed some of the items that we're talking about. Now, as soon as the presentation goes back up. Oh. Okay. So we'll skip the objectives as we've saw by the previous one of the things, and we'll also skip the definition of AI, which when our professor already talked about in the recent test. And we also saw that this act is mainly focusing on high-risk systems. And one of the things we have to remember when we're talking about economic impacts is what happens if you put regulations, okay? And one thing that we've seen, and I think Emanuele Girardi brought this up, is that there will be a cost. Now, we don't know if it's going to be 400,000 euros or if it'll be only a few thousand euros, but there will be a cost because anything which puts in obligations, restrictions, new developments, and such similar things, just adds costs, and it's an additional burden that companies may face. But let's start with some general considerations. Now, one thing that's very good is that the Act is a step towards harmonization and standardization. There was only one major, and it was a very huge success story, done by European nations, and that was the GSM standard in the telephone market, in the mobile systems market. So with standardization and harmonization, you should be able to see a good market development, a good standard, and something that helps the economy grow and also grows internationally beyond the European dimension. Another thing that we saw is that the human-centric approach has to be key. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of definitions for human-centricity. We don't know if what we're putting into place today is just a buzzword or if it's true human-centricity. And I'll get back to that later on. And another thing that we've seen is that the Act tries to address main concerns, main current, at least artificial intelligence software developments. But it also tries to integrate itself with the GDPR, which is very, very big and key. So it's building upon something which already is in place. However, there are some major, major obstacles. The European marketplace is made by member countries, and the whole Act falls upon the member countries to develop and to deliver. What happens here is that, okay, as we've seen recently, there is no harmonization amongst the European countries, not even in defining what is a value, what is a European value, and what is the kind of market that we want to develop. And we've seen it yesterday, okay? Yesterday, the Polish government decided that some things were not constitutionally available in Poland. So this is a major barrier. What happens is that you'll see different countries developing and trying to introduce different kinds of regulations. And this could hinder the harmonization and standardization approach. The other thing that we've seen is that the human-centric approach, as I said before, is very much based on a traditional cost-benefit, GDP, profit and loss model, okay? And that's not human-centric at all. It's very numerical. It's numbers. It's economic impact. It's dollars, euros. It's not human-centric, okay? And you need to go beyond that to understand the impact of such a system. So if we look at the first issues that come out of this, is that all the studies that I've read today say the same things, basically. There could be huge gaps in adoptions by companies and nations. And with this, I'm not talking about China, USA, Europe. I'm talking about inside every single nation, okay? These gaps can be obstacles or could be front runners of something that will happen in the near future. So what we're seeing is that most people and most studies say that front runners will probably double their returns by 2030. But what happens to the other countries? And what does that mean on the economic and geopolitical landscape, which could have huge, huge consequences? Another issue is winners and losers. You don't have winners and losers only in terms of countries, but in terms of people within those countries. And those gaps are really, really troubling, especially as Giacomo Bottas was saying, there are lots of social inequalities, economic inequalities that are already taking place today in our markets. So far from being a global equalizing force, artificial intelligence might divide nations, companies, and workers, creating these different sections of winners and losers, and enhancing social crises, inequalities, gaps, and so on. And this needs to be addressed, and no act addresses this, because it can't be done by a single government, which is not a single government for all the European countries. Another big problem is that AI has been seen as basically a cost reduction system, okay? What that means is that there's a lot of focus on internal cost reductions, which means you're trying to place reductions on humans, on human beings, on workers, on processes, okay? Now, this gives you lots of short-term gains, but in the long term, what happens to those displaced workers, skill sets, and so on? So that's something that's very, very important to acknowledge, is that that companies usually take this short-term perspective, and they never look at the long term. And this could really, really be a major offsetting force instead of being a driver. So one of the big things is that we'll have to ask ourselves is, will there be enough replacement by the emergence of people and cultural specialists? This is a term coined by the World Economic Forum. You'll see that there's going to be a lot of middle-class workers which will be displaced. They will not have safe jobs anymore. We're talking about financial analysts, accountants, auditors, lawyers, bank tellers, lots of things that we don't think about because we think about repetitive works as being the ones that are going to be replaced in the future. But we're actually talking about lots of other skills. And of course, there will be new jobs for data scientists, for professionals, user experience professionals, interaction designers. But will that offset the numbers of the huge numbers of people that are in the other categories of work? And that's something that needs to be understood. All the major studies have said, okay, at the end of the whole period, let's say by 2030, we'll have a consensus that there will be a net gain of jobs. Very small, but there will be. This is something that all the studies have said. McKinsey, Pricewaterhouse, all these companies have all come up with the same things. However, no study has put into factor what happens to the income gaps, the social hardships, the necessary soft skill developments and investments that need to be employed. What needs to be addressed, that there has to be a new model which has to be put into place to understand what's happening with the digitalization of our economies and with AI coming into place as quick as possible. And indeed, we'll have two different aspects. One of them is trying to understand the augmentation strategy which is needed. Augmentation means that we're looking at a broader horizon of value-creating activities that can be accomplished by human workers, often in complement to technology. There are so many jobs that we don't understand that can be coming up which are new and which need to be developed. Companies need to make themselves not only much more cost efficient, but smarter, a lot smarter. So you need to develop different kinds of skills, which are long-term and cannot be seen in the short term. The other point is having true human centricity. Okay, now how do you do that? You don't have to focus only on rights, fundamental rights, European values. If you don't consider a common platform by all the nations comprising the European Union that regards social and economic policies. You can't take humans as being at the center of your policy if you don't look at what's happening all around them in terms of what is social. What is the actual impact of helping these people with guided policies, which all companies together will understand as being a common platform? To do this, you need new growth indicators. You need social well-being indicators, okay? You need investments in social policies, in reskilling, retraining, and so much. And that is not in the Act, okay? It's probably not in the scope of the Act. But it is absolutely necessary to avoid to have huge disruptions in social and economic equality gaps in Europe today. So one thing that we see, especially in the McKinsey study, is that by the year 2030, we'll have new job creation, which is spurred by new demands, okay, new sources of demand. New sources of demand are rising incomes and consumption, an aging population which needs higher healthcare and personal services, and so on. The list is very comprehensive. However, those jobs, those kinds of skills, we don't know if they will create a larger income divide than what's already occurring today in the marketplace. We're looking at a higher proportion of people who were once middle class moving on to the lower middle class and probably to lower wager parts of the society. And that's creating already disruption and problems in terms of trying to educate, train, retrain, and do things about that. Then there's another big impact. If we're looking at a short-term investment policy, meaning that companies are using AI to be, let's say, getting better results in terms of cost gains, cost reductions, well, what's happening is that when you reduce those costs, you're not investing all that money that you're freeing. What you're doing is you're going into a financial sort of model and not more into an economic labor sort of model. That's what's happening today. You're seeing financial returns replacing labor returns. And this is creating a huge, huge disruptive force in which the bigger you get, the better you get. And the less you go in a trickle-down effect towards the rest of the economy. So we need to see what happens there. As companies try to get more gains, profits, and they're not investing a certain amount of money. And you can't be investing in huge amounts if you have AI, because AI is supposedly a system which will help you guide your costs. Okay, once you start the major investment, the additional replacements of software and services needed to maintain and put in other skills should be lowering by definition. We don't know what will be the end effects on social issues, wealth redistribution, and democratic institutions and stability. Because at the end of the day, if we have disruption coming in, you will have stress on your democratic institutions. Okay. I won't get into the slide exactly, but what we're seeing here is that there is a huge faith in innovation, productivity gains, which offset what is called disruptive forces. Can this be true? If you just take a look at the slide, innovation and disruption to the economy, you'll see that the net gain or net increase is really, really typically put into a faith, not into actual numbers or projections, of product and service innovation extension and competition. So this is going to offset anything which is supposed to be going into the transitional and negative externalities effect. It's a leap of faith, but in the same study, you'll see this. You'll see that there will be a major shift in wage distribution in terms of jobs and where they're being placed. And you're also looking at labor gains, which are fostered by innovation and redeployment. Now, this is a huge leap of faith, okay? And it's based on basically one simple assumption, is that we have a net gain only if the market scenario is maintained by using traditional cost-benefit and ideal market dynamics. It's basically a liberal market working at its best. But we have wage gaps. What time frame does this take place in? Social costs and such. Each European market then will also have its own definition in time frames. And that's what's going to make this whole model just explode, basically. Because each market, each European market will act differently. Different time frames, different caps, different adoption times. And so we might also face something which we don't want to face, which is an internal competition, a competitive environment, which is also within the European Union. And if you look at the ITU has two statements coming out, okay? It says, on one side, innovation in products and services could deliver up to 7% or around $6 trillion of potential GDP by 2030. Fine. The second point is that negative externalities of transition costs could reduce the gross GDP impact by about about $7 trillion, more than the basic gains. So you see that there's a lot of instability going on. Negative externalities could easily offset additional GDP growth brought by innovation in products and services. And if you take a look at this, we'll see that the instability is basically based with different kinds of models. Now, these are all the drivers that you could have put into place, okay? Unfortunately, what we're seeing here is just traditional transition and negative externalities working. The end impact is basically on par. It's not as high as people are expecting. What can really happen is that you really need to be able to face all this, severe space, fees to cover, your system integration, advertising, employee programs, training, and so on and so on. You need a common European Union social industrial policy. If you don't have this, that every single country will not be able to maintain a common standardization process and a growth process, which is on par for everybody. In other words, we won't have economies of scale and economies of scope to be able to deliver what the Act actually says. So to make it very quick, I hope I'm quick enough, okay, is that there are some final considerations, okay? The first one is that the Act is a good first step, great. It recognizes technology, it changes, and it's an attempt, actually a very bold attempt in trying to harmonize and standardize, guaranteeing human rights and so on. The focus on high risk, of course, will add additional costs, but we need to understand what, because at the end of the process, we don't know exactly yet what we need to put as additional costs. The harmonization and standardization efforts will could become economies of scale and scope also. So that could be also something like what we had with GSM 30 years ago, something which could be fostering an industry. However, the Act does not address the real social costs and the dynamics. Okay, notwithstanding this human-centric approach, we still need to address or create frameworks which regard a common economic and social policy, as well as also what the role of technological deployment is to deter and minimize all those negative effects that we saw before. Additional negative effects will be coming from the single members themselves, because they are diverse markets. Each country has its own market structure, its own production structure, its own harmonizing structure, and of course, its own laws and values. And that could be something which creates some barriers. Finally, some productivity gains, profit margins, higher revenues may not foster that proportionate additional investment and country tax revenue to be able to offset those social stress mechanisms. As I said, the financial market structures today do not guarantee the flows of money which countries can be able to use to even offset and create those training programs or social programs that might be necessary to address the new market reality. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I was very quick, but I promise.
So thank you, Angelo. I will ask if Andrea.
Yeah.
If you allow me, I would ask if there are questions for Professor Nardi, who has to leave, because in fact the end of the workshop was 12:45. So we can ask Andrea. You are a co-host like Angelo and myself. I consider you because of your affiliation with centricity. So if someone from the audience here and online has, yeah, also Fabrizio has to leave. Okay, so if you have technical questions for the computer scientists, let me say, maybe Andrea, would you assist me in this? We allow few questions for Fabrizio and Daniele, if any, and then we proceed with your presentation. We go on with your presentation after.
Okay, if they're not, decide about yourself. For me, it's the same.
Okay, So
Thank you, Andrea.
So do you have any question for Daniele and Fabrizio? Actually, yeah, Federica, I think it's, yeah, sure.
If I may, just a couple of comments on what Professor Daniele Nardi said. I just noted down some things. Well, first of all, I think you noted something that is super important, that is the question you asked, that how can we adjudicate the fairness of these systems regarding the Artificial Intelligence Act ex ante, if as we are talking also about the machine learning technologies, and even other speakers underline that much of what happens is something that the system develops as it accumulates data and experience. No, just to say that I mean, under Article 9 of the regulation, actually the assessment procedure is something that must be like continuously performed during the entire life cycle of the system, which does not make your comment less relevant, but perhaps even more relevant, because of course this will have a very hard, like practical implications. And then something that you noticed in your presentation is the reference to human oversight of the technology. I just wanted to add that like behind this word there is an entire and very encompassing debate, because among the different alternatives in terms of language that can be used to talk about human-machine interaction in these issues, like human oversight is the weakest language they could use. For example, in the European Parliament resolution, they used still a strong language talking about meaningful human review, while up to date in the debate, the strongest exception, the strongest expression of all is meaningful human control. So this is just to tell you that with reference to the Artificial Intelligence Act, in the end, they went for just human oversight. And I thought this was interesting. And then, but perhaps this is something that we can talk about in other occasions. You commented very much on the definition of artificial intelligence that is present in the EU Commission proposal. The European Parliament in the resolution had chosen a different methodology in order to define artificial intelligence. And I wonder whether that was perhaps a better solution. I think this is something we could all think about, as there is some still room in order to influence the process, because that definition, I think, would not make all the problems that you were referring to arise with regards to be too specific, and in this way leaving out things like the control systems that you referred to. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, I think there is really no answer. Thank you for all the comments. Both instructive for me, especially I look into this additional definition. In fact, it's, the point is that working and the other thing is that maybe I was certainly was not aware of the subtlety, the cause of the term oversight. Shortcut and referring to explainability, but I think for interpretability. But I think that if we get interpretability, we solve the oversight and make more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniele and Federica. I think Andrea has been patient far too much. Thank you, Andrea. And so I'll let you. Bye, Fabrizio. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
So,
May I present
I
it?
did you. Yeah.
Okay. The presentation, let me share with you. Okay.
So I really thank all the panelists. I have to the thankless task of closing this really useful moment, for which I thank again all the speakers. We're close to lunch, so I'm, as Marilena asked, I will try to be like a Japanese high-speed train, and I dramatically cut some of slides, so due to the time. So be patient with me. I'll try to understand better the legal structure of the proposal, and in this sense, I would like to highlight that, like Emanuela, I've been in the European AI Alliance Assembly, and it was very interesting and very useful to share with other key holders and stakeholders the ideas about the AI Alliance. And the high-level expert group surely gain a really push about this argument in all the European Commission, as Emanuela said. I think that the most important keyword that I suggest to underline better regarding the proposal is the harmonization. To harmonize something is a term that is very recurrent into the proposal. And the harmonization process has been very be fair into all the consistency with the policies provided. So we have we have no time to delve all of this. Surely Marilena will organize another time to delve more this aspect. But taking consideration that all the EU frameworks are part of a specific annex into the proposal. So other legal bases, of course, are can be found in the Article 114 of the Treaty of the Function of the European Union. And in this sense, it's interesting that the harmonizing part is also in parallel with common mandatory requirements. So in this sense, the restriction of use the AI in a legal aspect, that, trust me, is something that we are very far to regulate better, is focused in some areas. One of the areas that, in my opinion, is the most important one is the biometric one. So for me, the part which regards the biometric data, the biometric aspects of the proposal is the most rich, and it underlines the attention that the Commission had in the first time of the proposal. So probably this attention will be traduced also in the AI Data Act, that, as Emanuela said, we will see as soon as possible. And there are a lot of types of biometric categorization systems, and identification systems that are delved in deep into the proposal. Another interesting point is the definition of user. That is quite similar to the GDPR one, the GDPR person of data subject. And user for AI proposal means any natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body using an AI system under its authority. So the authority in the definition perspective stands about the possibility to accept where the AI system is used in the course of a personal or non-professional activity. So the domestic use is perhaps an exception. Another interesting part that is just been delved by other speakers regard the meaning of software, the definition of artificial intelligence system. So for the proposal, the definition is quite broad, because it means software that is developed with one or more the techniques of the approach listed in Annex 1. So as Nardi just said, basically all the software that are actually in the market. So it's interesting also to note that the system of authority is quite similar to the data protection authority bodies, and we have two different rails to push. The first one is the authority that is related to the notifying authority, and the other part is the certification one. So the certification body is the body that has the difficult duty to share the conformity assessment, as previously said by other speakers, and every member state has to assign one and decide where is cited. In the end, another thing that for me is very interesting to share with you today is the aspect of AI regulatory sandbox. That for me, for who cares about data protection, is one of the daily problem and daily issue under a legal scope, under a legal perspective. It's interesting to note that the providers, according to the proposal, should be able to process also special categories of personal data as a matter of substantial public interest in order to ensure the bias monitoring, detection, and correction in relation to a Highrisk AI system. So basically, the sandbox are something that also have been provided in the proposal that data protection authorities of Australia and Korea as recently published. One very short is the fact that whenever, according to the Australian Data Protection Information Commissioner, whenever an enterprise as an outsourcing contract on a third party for an AI system, before outsourcing or implementing a third-party AI solution, the organization should conduct a privacy impact assessment and a security risk assessment. That's interesting also because the proposal is based on a risk-based approach, so quite similar to the data protection in the data protection area. So far, to delve in deep, there's also a very useful checklist, self-checklist that the Personal Information Protection Commission, that in Korea is the equivalent of our data protection authority, stands all the steps that every single organization that want to do business in Korea with data and AI should advise and should be advised of in order to check is the ethics of AI system used. So also to start the discussion and to invite all the audience to start the discussion, I would like to underline 4 aspects that, in my opinion, will be surely revised in the final draft of the proposal. The first one is the liability and data protection issues that we all want to know after the AI Data Act will be coming in force. The other is the military applications. The proposal do not go in deep about the military application, but only about the high risk or the really high risk application that could be provided in AI environment. Also, we would like to have more legal guidelines about regulatory sandboxes because, as everyone who is a developer know, when you stand and develop a regulatory sandbox for AI system or to train every kind of software that use machine learning, a lot of personal data that are usually test data are processed, and we would like to know how the Commission wants to guideline our organization to be fair, to be comply with this regulatory system. At the end, we also hope more guidelines in regarding the certification and standards about AI technical aspects. Thank you, and thank you all. And Marilena, if you want to start a discussion on site, you're welcome to do it.
Thank you, Andrea, for your brevity. I must say that I have been encouraged to leave the room shortly. So if there are questions, so could you please post your questions in the chat? But no, there is a dedicated question and answer chat box. If there are questions in the room, okay, Andrea, I don't know if you want to say more, Riccardo, say some conclusive remarks, take home message. Otherwise, I will conclude. But it's, I mean, I'm sorry to conclude so in such this way, but all the talks, all the that we have had were so interesting, and next time there will be another occasion which we will leave more room to the discussion. This is just the beginning. I see people at the door here that want to come, so if you want to make Riccardo maybe very short conclusion because we have to leave the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilena. I will do my conclusion, my brief conclusion in Italian, so I will be molto più veloce. No, soltanto un ringraziamento a tutti. Io credo che pur nella ristrettezza dei tempi che avevamo, abbiamo imparato molto oggi. È stato bello confrontarci in quest'ottica interdisciplinare che è alla base, insomma, oramai dello sviluppo delle nuove tecnologie. Non si può pensare di legiferare senza avere e senza capire gli aspetti tecnici. Al tempo stesso, mentre si sviluppano gli aspetti tecnici, un occhio anche agli aspetti giuridici, ma anche etici, e se vogliamo appunto di regolazione in generale, sono ormai divenuti essenziali, per tacere, diciamo, degli effetti economici che a volte più che effetti sono le vere spinte verso l'innovazione. Quindi niente, davvero un grazie a tutti. Ho apprezzato personalmente tutti gli interventi. Mi dispiace, Marilena, di averti lasciato lì da sola a gestire il traffico, ma insomma non era possibile fare diversamente. Un caro saluto a tutti e alla prossima occasione. Grazie ancora.
Va bene. Grazie Riccardo, concludo anche io in italiano, tanto quest'ultima parte la possono tagliare. Il workshop è stato registrato, vi chiederanno l'autorizzazione a pubblicarlo oppure no, ma insomma si può... how to access the recording, this word is worth studying. Yeah, thank you very much. Where to write for a certificate of attendance. Thank you to all the speakers for being... Okay, so can you, Maria Camilla Fiazza, can you send me an email? My email is on the workshop page. In any case, you can easily find it by googling my name. Stavo parlando in italiano, quindi volevo concludere dicendo grazie a tutti, grazie a Federica. Grazie a Daniele, anche se adesso non c'è, a Fabrizio che è anche andato via, ad Emanuela Girardi, Angelo Cianciosi, si è data una bellissima prospettiva, diciamo, sul mercato, che tutti ovviamente, diciamo, adesso non solo Angelo, perché ce l'ho qui davanti, e Andrea che è stato così paziente, a tutti voi per essere stati qui presenti. Adesso davvero vi saluto e con la promessa di incontrarci di nuovo, la speranza anche di avervi, perché è stato veramente interessante. Grazie, arrivederci.
Grazie. Ciao a tutti.
Grazie a voi, ciao.